So what do we mean by the Upstander Ripple Effect?
Stand up against hate and prejudice, even if it does not affect you.
From moral dilemmas in today's headlines, upstanders who rose for justice, and stories of survival.
Be prepared to walk away from this conversation inspired and motivated.
I'm Jackie Congedo.
And I'm Kevin Aldridge.
What you do right now in this moment matters. And over the course of the next hour, we're going to show you just how true that is.
From stories of courage and resilience from those who survived one of the darkest chapters in human history to everyday people doing their small part to have a big impact, we want to inspire you and motivate you to start your own ripples of change in the world.
We're also going to have a fresh take on the news of the moment. How can the echoes of history inform how we think about what's happening today? And how can we open up more space for deeper conversation about the challenges that we face instead of our instincts sometimes to just shut down?
A lot of care and intention went into the name of this podcast. What do we mean by the Upstander Ripple Effect? We believe that one person can choose to stand up in just one moment in a wave that sets off ripples of positive change.
That's something we have been talking about, Kevin and I, for a long time, long before we had microphones in front of our faces like we do today. And it's just really exciting that we're here. First episode. Feels like it's been a long time coming.
Yeah. And I'm really excited about the stories that we're going to tell and lifting up, because I think it's something that's really needed in these days and times when we look around at the world and you can be so discouraged by what you find on your social media feeds or when you cut on the TV, and it can feel a bit overwhelming. And a lot of folks might be thinking to themselves, well, what can I do about any of this stuff? Well, that's what this podcast is all about, how to show even the smallest things can make a big difference.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think, like you said, we get overwhelmed by the magnitude of the issues, and the digital media, social media algorithms aren't helping with that, right? It feeds us the stuff that we know makes us come back for more doom scrolling, and so how do we sort of flip that narrative a little bit? How do we say, okay, let's instead spend more mental energy on what can I do? What is the one thing I can do? And then the power in that is, it's actually not just one thing. It's one thing in the moment that we know leads to another thing and another thing, and then someone else inspired to do something else. And so, when we do something in a moment, we don't know what happens later. And we're so excited to have this space to be able to talk about that and show people how actually just one act in one moment really does make a difference.
Absolutely. I think it's also great that we get an opportunity to highlight heroes, like the good works that people do. It's like so much we focus on the negative things that happen, and the most outrageous individuals get the headlines. And so a lot of times we wind up hearing about these terrible things that terrible people do. But what I'm going to love about what we're going to do is we're going to hear about how really good people respond to ugly things. And that's going to be an exciting part of the podcast.
Yeah.
I think will be uplifting.
Yeah. Look for the upstanders, right? It's like, where are the people who are leveraging their strengths to do the right thing in any given moment in big and small ways? I think a lot about how, we talk about upstanders in the museum down at Union Terminal at the Holocaust and Humanity Center. And, it's easy to get sort of overcome by the magnitude of the loss, right? We think about 6 million people, each of those people, and the ripple effects of that loss. And there are the ripple effects of the rescues, the moments of rescue, the moments of upstanding. And where would we be, right? We wouldn't have a museum with survivors to share those stories without those acts of upstanding that happened throughout history and that continue to happen today. Okay, now I'm going to bridge from something very heavy to something not so heavy about coffee, because something happened to me this morning before we get going at Starbucks. I'm going to give a shout out to the Kenwood Starbucks, even though this really wasn't them. You'll hear in a minute. I'm getting coffees for you and me and for our amazing producer, Ann Thompson, because everyone runs on coffee. And I pull up to the window to pay, and this guy opens the window and he says, actually, the person in front of you just paid for you.
Wow.
And I said, the person was gone. I couldn't even see license plate. Who is this person? And of course, I was too busy to even notice before that who that person was in front of me. And I was like, really? I didn't even know what to do. And then it occurred to me, I'm going to pay for the person behind me.
Nice.
So I said, okay, well, here, take this and pass it on, right? It's like, so, and it lifted me clearly, I guess the person who did this got something out of it, lifted them. Maybe the person in front of them paid for them. I mean, who knows? It lifted, I hope, the people behind me. I don't know what they did with the ball when they got it. And it lifted the guy at the window. The guy at the window was like, yeah, man, we're all like stuck on this planet together. So we just got to do what we got to do to help each other. And little things like that, it really set the tone for my whole day.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's, you said it, that's an example, like how that changed, that small act might have changed the trajectory of your day, even in a small way, even if it's just like an attitude adjustment or an energy adjustment. And then the thought that you had to then pay it forward to the next person. And like you said, you don't know what that person might do with the ball. And that's not really even the point. You know, it's not important that we necessarily understand what someone does with the ball and what they take with it. That's part of the idea of the ripple effect. I think so many people that we'll hear about on this podcast did things not knowing what their action was going to have on down the road. And so, that's a great story. Thanks for sharing that this morning.
So your coffee this morning brought to you by Upstander of the Day, who
absolutely
thought to just do their little part in their little moment. So it's going to be a great series of conversations. We're so glad you're here along with us for the ride, because we live in turbulent, bumpy times, and we all need spaces to think about our own agency to be the best of humanity today. So, you know, from coffee to other things that are maybe more meaningful or substantive, you've got a ripple effect story you've got to share with everybody, because this is really so powerful.
Yeah, no, thanks. So for the listeners who might not know, in addition to the work that I do with the Inquirer and here with the podcast, I also own a semi-professional basketball team here in the city of Cincinnati called the Ohio Kings.
You're Kevin of many talents, Kevin of all trades.
Blessed and highly favored. Let's just say
there you go. It's good.
But we came into some information. There's a community activist here in Cincinnati named Iris Rowley, and she came to us several months ago about a group of young men that she had been working with. And these young men had an unfortunate encounter with police. They were in the middle of the street there near Reading Road. These were Woodward students, and they were selling bottles of water in the middle of the street, trying to make a little money as kids do, as I did when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, in the process of that, they were kind of obstructing traffic. It kind of became a thing, and it was a not so positive interaction that they had there with the police. And so Iris got involved with these young men, and she wanted to give them an opportunity to show them how to take what was a positive kind of an entrepreneurial idea, but show them kind of how to do it in the right way. So she began working with these young men, and they formulated their own group called Brothers in Motion. And she was trying to help them develop their own brand of bottled water with their label on it and everything. So Iris came to me and she said, "Hey, I know you started this basketball team, and I think it's important for these young men to see someone who looks like them, who's in an entrepreneurial space, doing some things. So would you be willing to come in, kind of take on a mentoring role and sort of work with these young men?" And so we got together and we came up with this idea that we were going to allow these young men to come in and sell water at our concession stand during our games.
Love it.
And so I went in, we negotiated terms of a contract.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of talked to them about that.
That's a skill.
They were gonna give me the farm basically. And I had to kind of teach them, like, no, you don't give away all of the leverage and what you have. You know, this is how you kind of negotiate the deal. And for the entire season, they sold water at every one of our home games.
Wow.
And it was a great experience for them. Great experience for us, and it was a perfect example of the ripple effect, sort of starting with Iris, who saw young men who were trying to do something that came out of a not so positive situation. She acted on that, kind of got these young men together, and then came to us and said, "Hey, is there something that you can do?" And of course, we were in a position, because we had a platform, to be able to assist these young men and just hearing from them after their experience, sort of what they learned. And these guys were like sponges. They watched everything that I did, every move that I made, and it was interesting to hear them just kind of talk about after the games what they had observed and learned, and it was just a great experience for them. And who knows, one of these young men could go on one day to be the CEO of Pepsi or Coca-Cola or something like that. You just never know. But that's my ripple effect story, and
I love that story. I love it because it came from a moment of real, wasn't a happy start, right? And you had an upstander, in this case Iris and you, who stepped in and said, like, what can we do to like actually harness the parts of this that are really good, and make this an opportunity, and look what's become of it. So next season they're coming back, I'm assuming.
Yeah, we're going to try to, I don't know if the same group of young men are going to try to come back, but it actually, a ripple effect of that was we looked at it, and what we're trying to do now is create sort of like an entrepreneurial program to where we can bring in more and different kids to come in and give them an opportunity to engage in, some entrepreneurial endeavors that match up with what we do with basketball. So that's another tendril of the ripple effect, is that it's kind of inspired us to say, hey, how can we scale this, expand it, and open it up to more young people so they can have that same experience.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's awesome. So, we're moving from sort of into our first segment, and we really couldn't have asked for two stories that better illustrate the power of the ripple effect. Maybe other than the basketball one that you just shared, except for the two we're going to share with you today. And when we think about how most people, students, really, so many students, millions of students around the world learn about Holocaust history, usually it's through, at least at first, through one of two books, right? Elie Wiesel's Night or The Diary of Anne Frank. Most kids read these at some point in their sort of, middle high school careers. And today we have stories of two people who have personal connections to both of those stories.
First, though, we want to talk about some things going on in the world right now. Our goal is for this to be a place where you can come to get help processing news and issues with a humanity first lens.
Humanity first lens. Who's going to be the keeper of that mantra? Because the stories we're going to talk about aren't always so rosy and happy and, Pollyannish. They are tough stories. We're living in a time when there's a lot of challenge in our world and a lot of upheaval. But, we're committed to this being a place where we can look for the upstanders in these moments, and where we can think about how what we know about history, the kind of history that we teach at the center, can maybe just give some context for how we think about things that are happening today. The first sort of set has to do with what we've been seeing across college campuses, in the last several of months, really. Now across 22 states, at least, I think the latest numbers we had, 7 of 8 Ivy League schools, just more than 50 some encampments and protests having to do with the conflict in the Middle East and students raising their voices. And more, unfortunately, as part of those protests. So, this is a tough moment, I think, for universities to navigate, because they're trying to walk the line,
for sure, between
protecting, a campus as an environment where free speech is celebrated and protected, where freedom of ideas is critical, and to keep people safe. And unfortunately, we've seen in some of these protests, I would argue many of them, more than some, the kind of language and action that actually bumps up right up against, if not crosses the line into creating an environment where students are not actually safe.
Yeah.
And some of them have gotten really violent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think in addition to educating, I think creating a safe space is one of the top priorities of any institution of learning. I mean, I think when most parents send their kids away to college, they expect them to be educated, but they also expect them to be safe. And so I think that, we can have this conversation around, these protests and free speech, which is a right. I know you and I both agree in very, very strongly.
Yeah, absolutely.
but free speech up to the point where people are put in danger. That's where you do have to draw the line. And I think more colleges, whether they were unprepared for this or don't have the infrastructure to meet the moment, I think it's something that they certainly have to make a stronger investment in. If you're going to allow your campuses to be places where you're going to have this type of demonstration and expression, you've got to make sure that you've created a safe environment there where people can have the right to exercise their free speech, but also everybody feels like they're protected. They don't have to worry about physical injury, things of that nature. And so I think colleges really have to focus in and zero down on that and making sure that these demonstrations remain peaceful, that they follow the law, and that everyone feels like they're safe and protected.
Yeah, and I think it's a physical safety issue. And I was reading the statement that President Carter of the Ohio State University, not the other President Carter, made on April 29th after they had to sort of disband an encampment on campus, talking about his decision to do that, and talking about how the reason these aren't allowed is because they create the need for around-the-clock security, which takes resources away, right? And so to your point, just trying to level up with we can't have this in a way that maintains the safety of our students. So there's a physical safety concern. But the other thing is, I think there's a lot of confusion over language that's happening at these protests. Right? When people are vilifying, quote, Zionists or, talking about globalizing the Intifada. There may be folks who are caught up in the frenzy of protest on campus who might not realize what those terms mean. But the idea that Zionism, the right to just national self-determination for Jews, like any other ethnicity, which is so core to Jewish identity, is vilified to the point of saying, we're going to destroy or eliminate this movement, these people. That's an inciting threat.
Absolutely.
And so there's a lot of that happening too. And I'm just not so sure that everybody who's caught up in these protests realizes what they're saying. I want to believe the goodness in me wants to believe that.
I think that that's true. I mean, I think that's one of the dynamics of sort of like protest movements or demonstrations is that you have people who are a part of these things, and they're in it for the right reasons. They're in it for the cause. But then we also have to recognize that there are what we call sort of like these professional disruptors or demonstrators who come in with a specific agenda, and they can come in and they can hijack or they can muddle the messages. I mean, we see this in all sort of protest movements across the country, whether we were talking about George Floyd or whether we're talking about this, that there are people who come into and make themselves a part of these protests, movements and demonstrations who don't have the best of intentions, who are trying to incite and do different things. And so when you have, maybe well-meaning college students who do want peace in the Middle East and want a resolution and hostages released and these are the things that you're protesting for, when suddenly elements come in and they join this protest that you've maybe started or that you're a part of, and those voices become a part of that. It can be, it takes on sort of a life of its own and a different element. So I wouldn't go so as far as to say that perhaps every student who is involved in that even knows or understands some of the language or even cosigns some of the language that's in there. But unfortunately, I think that's sometimes what happens when you get these big protest and demonstration movements that become so large. You can't really control who becomes a part of these things.
And I mean, I think I'm a little bit further from where you are on it, because I was willing to say that in the beginning. And now that I think it's been so widely publicized, like how not only violent, but like, some of what these things are calling for. I just think that like students have to be somewhat aware that when there are giant banners
Sure.
that are
Yeah.
calling for, this is the Jews are the next target, or Israel's the next target, or, like what you saw on October 7th, guess what? There's more coming, celebrating
Right.
that. It's a really hard thing for me to just kind of give people the benefit of the doubt that they don't
Sure.
realize they're supporting that. I realize that, like, okay, well, where's the movement? Where's the protest with responsible rhetoric that calls for a two-state solution and peace and,
Right.
upholding everybody's right to self-determination and returning the hostages? Like, that isn't the movement. That's
Mm-hmm.
not what's out there. And that's, I'm sure, frustrating for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But it's I'm thinking about what it must be like to be Jewish, walking through Columbia right now, trying to take a
Sure.
final exam, trying to get to your class. And you literally, in some cases, they haven't been allowed through because these encampments are so large, and they're not allowing people who have visible signs of Jewish identity
Right.
into that. And so that is, I think, deeply problematic, to say the
Without
least.
question. Yeah.
But it is, this is a struggle, I think, that we're going to continue to, as a country, and certainly universities are going to continue to have to wrestle with, because it is really important, that
Absolutely.
universities remain space where people can debate and discuss ideas that are, in some ways provocative, obviously, or, this is how social movements in some ways happen. But I think that, like, this one seems to have really crossed some lines, red lines in my book. And I hope that the pendulum can swing back.
Yeah, and then I also think you got to think, like, what is the end goal of the protest, right? So
Yeah, right.
is our goal just to to scream and yell at each other and say these things, or is it to try to create some type of dialogue where we can have some sort of understanding, or reach a common ground, or general understanding of where everyone's position is? And so I sort of wonder, like, on these college campuses, are those sorts of efforts underway or taking place where we're actually trying to bring together, opposing groups in conversation, and understanding, and trying to help understand, hey, how do we take the what may be some legitimate concerns, and hear one another and have a conversation and create, a campus environment? Or is it just, to maintain disruption into perpetuity? I always feel like some of the greatest movements, the demonstrations, were a means to get a seat at the table, to begin to have a conversation, to try to resolve things. I don't know that I'm getting the sense that there's much of that, particularly when I see, some protesters, shouting down people who, may even be trying to engage, or say, hey, we hear what you're saying, and let's have a conversation about this. So I think we have to, not just in this instance, but on so many instances in our country, is the point the argument, or is the point to try to reach some kind of reasonable conclusion or resolution? I feel like too often today that the point is the argument.
The argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're now worked up. This whole thing has been worked up into such a fervor that, it's not just argument. I think that there's some real harassment that's happening.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
and that's a deep. I mean, if I had kids in college right now, I would be concerned about
Absolutely.
it. So
Absolutely.
we'll keep an eye on that. There are upstanders, though. I mean, there are upstanders who are trying to do their small parts. I'm thinking about this piece that, in my mind, President Carter at Ohio State, to take a stance on this and say, and he was very deliberate in his letter. This isn't about free speech, but at the end of the day, there are rules about what you can and can't do on campus.
Absolutely.
And we have to be able to allow people to go to class, to take their final exams. We have to create, ensure an environment of safety, and these things compromise that. And so I think, it's not an easy thing to stand up and say that right now. And
Sure.
I think that took a lot of courage and upstanding to do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you've seen, it's a sign of leadership. I mean, I think you've
Yeah.
seen good leadership, and I think you've seen bad leadership
right.
in the cases in some of these universities. And bad leadership has cost, some of these college presidents their positions. And so I think we always have to stand on the side of rules and law and safety. Certainly, again, free speech, something that we believe in, but when that crosses a line, I think leadership does have to stand up and say, hey, this has gone a step too far. We want to create space for that, accommodation for that, but we cannot allow, rules to be broken, laws to be broken, people's lives to be put in danger. When it crosses that line, we have to act on it. And that can't be looked at as suppressing free speech. I mean, look, he was very clear that the rules were made apparent to the students about, what the rules were on encampments ahead of time. They said they understood that. They went forward, anyway. And I get that sometimes in protest movements, disruption is a part of the thing, is a part of the tactic. But also folks who were in those positions knew and understood and were even prepared to deal with the legal ramifications of that at the time. That was kind of the point behind it. So, but you can't cry after the fact when you're breaking the rules that somehow this is suppressing free speech, because that, we can't do that either.
Yeah. And so the second piece we want to kind of address is another aspect of free speech in some ways, having to do with symbols and flags and what symbols mean to different people and where they're posted and flown and what's allowed and what's not, and how to respond to those things. There's been a couple of these recently, thinking St. Patrick's Day weekend, which was the day of the St. Patrick's Day race. There was this banner that was hung over Columbia Parkway, "Save Ireland from the Jews." Deeply concerning. And there's a number of other things, and we see these on occasion, but it seems like there's more and more of them where we have, swastika flags. There's one in Coleraine Township. There is, Dan Horn did an amazing job sort of trying to tell the whole story of this Confederate flag that's been flying. Now there's 3 of them, from what I understand, in Harrison. And so, it's interesting, I think, as we think about symbols and speech. We live in a country where that's protected, and there's reasons for that, right? It's like, well, who decides what's hateful and what's not, and that's a slippery slope. And things like swastika flags or Confederate flags serve a purpose, right? And that's to, in some ways, normalize ideas that are connected to those flags or those symbols that make certain people feel a certain way and that project this level that this is permissible, this is okay. And that creates space for violence. I mean, we saw it we see it in the history, right? I think about Al Miller's quote, "The Holocaust didn't start with bullets, it started with words."
Sure.
And so, while it's allowed, I think we got to pay attention to those things. And what I love about each of these stories actually is there are upstanders in each one who said, that's their right to free speech, and I have my right to speech.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to speak louder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that you have to do when you run up into these types of situations. I mean, look, these symbols, some people will say, well, these symbols only have the power in which, you give them. It's just a piece of cloth. It's just this old relic. It doesn't mean anything. But I think it's easy for those who are not the targets of these symbols, who historically have not been the targets of these symbols, to kind of feel that way, because those who fly those banners, they don't just do it without intent. If you fly a Confederate flag these days, if you fly a flag that has a swastika, you're trying to send a very clear message. I think in these days and times, it's kind of like what you were saying about the banners on college campuses. You have a hard time believing that people don't get what that is and know what that's being heard. Right. Especially in these days and times, if you're doing that, you're doing it with an intention to send a message to someone. And, for many African Americans, Black people, the Confederate flag sends a very clear message. Yep. You're not welcome. Yep. It's trying to intimidate, send a message of fear. Some will say, it's a sign of Southern heritage. Yeah, but what did that Southern heritage represent? What did it stand for in those days and times? So you can't get away from the messaging of these types of things, and the discomfort and the fear and the message that it tries to send. And so I think that, those of us who want to stand up to those types of things and hate, have to vocalize, have to stand up, and as they did in Harrison, and say, hey, this doesn't represent me. This doesn't represent, I believe, the vast majority of people who live in this community. And if you don't do that, the silence implies complicity.
It speaks for itself, right? And I mean, I got to give the mayor credit for spending the first couple months, well, until now, I guess, of his term, right after he was elected. This has pretty, dominated his desk, and he has been unequivocal that, there's nothing I can do about these. They're on private property, but I want to be clear as day that this doesn't reflect me. This doesn't reflect the city of Harrison. He's been returning phone calls after phone calls. He's been proactively reaching out, particularly to people of color in that community, to help them understand that he's on their team here, that he sees that. And what I love, probably actually more than the Upstander story in this piece by Dan Horn, I love this bit about this 15-year-old Kaylani. So this is a 15-year-old high school sophomore. Black young lady who was sort of asked about how this makes her feel. That was one of the things that I used to really get under my nails in journalism, is here's this terrible thing. How does it make you feel? How do you think it makes me feel? Regardless, she, in sort of, I think she so eloquently speaks in this piece about, I'm just a 15-year-old kid. I'm trying to live my life. I didn't think much about it. Now I'm thinking more about it. And what I love about this interview is she stood up, just projecting your own humanity.
Yes.
In a moment where the intention is to dehumanize is an act of upstanding.
Yes.
It reminds me of Jesse Owens. We have this on our mural wall in the museum. You got to come down and see it, Union Terminal, if you haven't. Al Miller, one of our survivors, was a young boy in Berlin. And he's standing there. He was at the Berlin Olympics, and he watched Jesse Owens win gold, and refers to him as his hero. He watched his hero win gold, and he watched Hitler leave the stadium. And, just Jesse existing in a space where he wasn't wanted. And by the way, Jesse wasn't supposed to run. Sam Stoller, Jewish guy from Cincinnati, Hughes High School grad, was supposed to run. Couldn't run because it was 1930s Germany. Okay. So both of them, actually, just by existing in this space where they weren't wanted, asserting their own humanity, is an act of upstanding. So shout out to 15-year-old Kaylani in Harrison, who is asserting her humanity every day in the face of dehumanizing symbols.
Yeah. Well, and I think another way that we can be upstanders, not just asserting your humanity as being an upstanding quality, which I think it is, but also we can be upstanders by not dismissing, the humanity in others that doesn't match ours. And here's what I mean by that is each of us are affected differently, can be affected differently by the same thing. But what we have a tendency to do is because we may not be bothered by something or it doesn't impact us in a certain way, we tend to diminish someone else's humanity and how it impacts them. And we say, well, why are you making such a big deal out of this? Why does it matter to you so much? The part of us that can be upstanders is resisting that and just acknowledging the feelings and the humanity of somebody else, that if this is so bothersome to somebody else, it doesn't matter that we don't understand it or we don't quite get it. I've had to learn this in my own interactions with my wife. At home, there's some things she gets riled up about that as a man, I just don't get it. And I had to reach the point where I said,
she probably has none of those things about you, though.
I'm sure she doesn't. But I had to arrive at the point that said, it shouldn't matter that I don't understand it. It should matter that it matters to her.
That's right.
And so when we look around and we see so much division in our world, this is why I just want to speak to people who are wondering, who are thinking that way, why does this matter and why is this such a big deal? It doesn't really hit me like that. If you're sick of the division that we have in our country right now, understand that type of attitude lends to that, because if more people spoke up in these types of situations. And I really do want to believe that there are more people who don't support this kind of thing that do.
Yeah.
But it's the silence. It's the, oh, I don't understand, or I don't see this as such a big deal thing that keeps people silent from being just the upstander that allows them to just, commiserate with someone or feel their pain in a situation. Creates those divisions because it makes you feel, if you feel that way, it makes you feel like you're alone, that nobody has my back, that other people, that more people than I think this way.
Yep.
And so that's why it's important for us to recognize why this stuff matters, because it creates the division that we say that we hate.
I think there's more we could say about all of this, and I'm curious to hear from folks who are listening what their thoughts are. In our show notes, you can find out how to contact us. We'd love to hear from you. What are your experiences around free speech and hate speech in this moment? How are you feeling about what you're seeing on the news related to what's going on college campuses? And what do you think about this idea of symbols and how we receive them in our world and what that does to our communities? Would love to hear from you, but in the interest of time, we're going to pivot to our segment from the archives. This is a really special place for us at the Holocaust and Humanities Center because in the basement of Union Terminal, most people don't know about this, are thousands of documents and artifacts that have been given to us mainly by Cincinnati Holocaust survivors or others with connections to this chapter of history. Many of these pieces, these sort of priceless and timeless pieces, until now have not been shared publicly because we don't have the space to exhibit everything in our collection at the museum at Union Terminal.
This artifact we're about to share with you is an incredible piece of history and a terrific example of the power of the ripple effect. One question from one student led to a friendship that spanned thousands of miles between a Cincinnati nun and Anne Frank's father.
I'm so excited to share this. We have this incredible artifact that tells the whole story. There are two clips we're going to share with you. I got to hear the story of this artifact firsthand from our director of collections and exhibitions, Corey Silbernagel, who is such an amazing caretaker of our collection. And then, as if that wasn't good enough, we were lucky enough to find Sister Nancy herself doing well, Sylvania, Ohio. And she actually made a trip all the way down. She refused to let us come to her. She said, no, I'm coming down there. I'm doing just fine. To visit us at the Holocaust and Humanities Center. And Corey hosted her for this amazing conversation about this story. So take a listen.
This album belonged to Sister Nancy Linenkugel, who was a teacher in Cincinnati at St. Anne's School. She was teaching 8th grade students in 1974 when they were learning about Anne Frank. They had a lot of questions that she just didn't know the answer for. So she told her students, well, let's write a letter to Otto Frank as a classroom exercise.
Her father, Anne's father.
Yeah.
Wow.
So Anne Frank's father was still alive at that point. The students write questions, and she sends them to the book publisher for Anne Frank's diary, Doubleday. So the letter goes to Doubleday, and it makes its way to Otto Frank.
Oh my gosh.
And he responds to it. So Sister Nancy documents everything that happened following that in this this scrapbook.
So smart to keep the documentation of it. I mean, just
yeah, absolutely.
How thoughtful.
So here, this is the letter. January 26, 1975, she writes, Otto, whose signature is here, writes back to her saying, 29 of your students wrote letters to me. I'm very pleased to receive them as they show their deep understanding for Anne, her diary, and the suffering of the Jews. And he encloses
I enclose here
answer.
with my answer to all of the young people, as I cannot write to everyone separately. Mm-hmm. I hope they will be satisfied anyhow, as I tried to answer all the questions they had. As I did not make a copy of my first letter to you, I do not know if I drew your attention to 2 books which may be of interest to you and your pupils. So he actually responds, answers the questions, and then says, for more information, here's these 2 books you might.
Yeah.
Oh, so cool.
So then here is the actual letter that he writes to the students. it's quite long, but a few really interesting things. How is life in the secret annex? Anne herself describes it so well that I could not do better. Wow. There's different notes that he puts in here that give really interesting perspective, and really give the students reading this a direct connection with this story that is so such a global story, such a recognized name. Almost everyone knows who Anne Frank is.
Yes.
But these 29 students had an opportunity to really get to know her more.
To connect with the history and to connect with her family.
Absolutely.
And just Sister Linenkugel, who, had sort of the audacity, right, in a good way, to say, you know what? Let's ask her dad. I mean, who thinks you're going to get a response? It's going to get to him. And then what follows is that he writes back, and not only does he write back, but there's more to the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to answering some of the questions, he sends the children some photos of he and his wife. Anne Frank's mother did not survive. Anne did not survive. Otto's the only survivor of their immediate family, and he remarries after the war. So here he is with his second wife. He sends the children some postcards of Switzerland. That's where he and Fritzi, his wife, are living. Again, helps those students make that connection to space, to place.
Yeah.
He continues corresponding with Sister Nancy. They write.
And this is her. It says Gilbert, but this is her. I guess her.
It is. Yeah. So this is still Sister Nancy. They continue writing. Otto first writes back to the students in January of 1975. By the end of that year, she takes a trip with her sister to Switzerland.
Oh my gosh.
And meets Otto in person.
Wow.
So, much of this correspondence is planning for the trip, checking in with each other. Then she arrives in Zurich.
Wow.
These are some memories of that trip. A really great photo of Sister Nancy and her sister as they traveled together. Yep.
She looks like she was in her 30s at the time. Maybe.
I don't know. Yeah, young.
Yeah,
definitely young. And probably more adventurous than I
am
in my 30s now.
Yeah.
So these photographs document meeting Otto Frank.
Oh my gosh.
Here they are walking on the street together. I recall Sister Nancy telling me that these photos were taken as Otto and Fritzi are giving her a tour of their garden. Just a normal couple.
Amazing. Wow.
So they continue to correspond with each other through the end of Otto's life. They become friends, a world apart, but have this connection through education. And there's a letter somewhere in here where Otto tells Sister Nancy that, surely her work in revealing the depth of this story will have an impact on those students.
Wow.
And will inform the rest of their lives. So I think, they were connected through like this desire to
understand,
to want to share, and understand.
Yeah, and I think about, where are those kids now? Those 29 students.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Went out into the world, and some probably had families of their own, and what are their kids doing? I think about those moments that you had in school that were particularly memorable or really special. A field trip you got to take that other classes didn't, or, some experience. And for these kids, I'm sure that this ongoing sort of pen pal relationship through their teacher with an incredible figure from history, really, is something that made a lasting impression on. I mean, there's no way to walk out of an experience like that at a school and not be completely changed by how it's
Yeah, absolutely
impacted you.
I mean, I also think,
wow.
you know, Sister Nancy must have been such an incredible educator, right?
Yes.
Like, she could have taught her Holocaust unit, shared about the Diary of Anne Frank, and just ended it at what she had to do. But she took it one step farther. And, I mean...
And the power of sort of inquisitive, you know, the idea
yeah.
that, like, it's all about asking questions. And if I don't have the answers, we can find the answers. Or let's search for the answers.
Promoting critical thinking.
Yes. She really was ahead of her time in a lot of ways, I think, probably at that time. How exciting. She must have been thrilled when they got that response. Can you imagine?
Absolutely, yeah. I think she, you know, I think that she had the students write the letter as a classroom exercise, assuming, you know, that the publisher would never forward that letter on, that it would just be, you know, lost on someone's desk.
Yeah.
But it wasn't.
Look, and this is, I guess, what he wrote her after she had returned home. Mm-hmm. It's so nice to hear from you and to know that you enjoyed your trip to Switzerland so much. My wife and I were very glad to have had you and your sister in our home, and we really appreciated your keen interest in all we showed you. Your wonderful self-made Star of David is on the wall of my study, and I show it proudly to all of my friends and visitors. So she came with...
She brought him a gift. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just hard to overstate, you know, we make these connections and what becomes of that? Like, what happens as a result of that? What happened to the 29 kids who were in that class? What, you know, happened as a result of, who knows where that Star of David is right now, and, you know, who's telling that story? So, what an incredible moment captured in this album, and what a really incredible example of the power of connection. Thank you for showing it to us. I think so too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Was so taken by the goodness of Otto Frank. The thing I remember most about him is that he said, do not hate. If you hate, nobody will know you hate them, but you'll be miserable. And I always thought that was the most wonderful thing, because if anybody had a reason to be hateful, look what all happened to him.
What a story.
Yeah, that was great.
I mean, it's actually amazing. It is an amazing example of the ripple effect. Just one student in one Catholic 8th grade class said, like, I got a question, and launched an entire relationship that spanned all this time and this space. I really do want to find those kids.
Yeah, I mean,
the 29 now not kids.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great story, because it's a testament to. It reminds me, in journalism, you know, they say the only dumb question is the one you don't ask, right? And so this student asked this question, and it sets off these ripple effect of events, and to see the sister take that and turn it into a class assignment. Again, as they said in the video, that it would have just been very easy just to teach, you know, straight from the book, you know, do your what you got in your lesson plan. She took the learning to another level, and look what it spanned, not just for those 29 students in her class that day, but for all of us, all of these many years later. And the fact that she kept all of that correspondence and documentation and postcards and stuff written on that. I mean, that's just amazing. It's like most stuff these days we just kind of toss in the trash. You know, we're so such a disposable society pretty much anymore. And the fact that she was able to maintain all of these things and keep them in such great shape to where you can, you know, look at them and read them and almost transport you back in the history. It really is just an amazing story that just shows how things can stack on top of each other just by the smallest of actions. And as someone who gets a ton of correspondence on their desk every day,
How many letters are you saving, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, man, the fact that the publisher passed that along to him, I'm just thankful I wasn't in that publisher's office that day, because that probably would have never made its way to Otto, and we wouldn't be talking about that here today. But thankfully, you had some conscientious people at the publisher who took that.
That's right. Shout out to the student who asked the question, to Sister Nancy for leaning in with curiosity, for really just saying, like, I'm going to be curious about that. And let's just actually see. And then to the publisher for saying, I don't know, but I know a guy who does know, and I'll send it along to him. So really a special story, a treasure part of our collection. And and we're just so grateful for that Sister Nancy was able to come and sit down with us and share a little bit more about this journey for her. So.
Yeah, for sure. Well, every month we'll also bring you a story of someone who is an upstander, a person who uses their character strengths to stand up for themselves and others.
Yep. And this month we're sharing a part of a conversation I had with Elisha Wiesel. You're probably familiar with the name Elie Wiesel. Elie survived the Holocaust, was liberated from Buchenwald, and went on to become an author, of course, of the esteemed book Night, as well as other works, and a Nobel Laureate.
Elie died in 2016. His son now works to carry on his father's legacy. Most of us know Elie Wiesel as a scholar and author, but for Elisha, he was just dad. We're honored to share parts of this conversation here.
And sort of through that path, you had certain milestones from what I've, listened and read about your relationship with your dad and some of the experiences you had. You went back with him to Romania.
I did.
To see sort of for yourself some of those early chapters in his life. Can you tell me a little bit what that was like to be there with him?
Yeah, I can, but I would just say one thing on the bumpiness question, which is the resolution to my relationship with my father didn't start magically on that one trip to Romania. It really had to do with the way my father dealt with me and the patience that he showed. And there are Hasidic stories that I can tell you that inform how and why he did that. But he was an incredible father because he gave me the space. He recognized what a burden it was to be the son of such a prominent Holocaust survivor. And he realized what a burden it is to be a Jew, that it can be a burden in this day and age. And he was so respectful and so patient with me that the groundwork for an eventual return, I think, was laid very early. We went in spring of 1995, or maybe even summer, to Sighet, Romania. We did a trip to Sighet, and then we went to Auschwitz. And it was me, my father, and my cousin, Steve, who really is a brother to me. It's my father's sister's son. And it was a turning point for me. I had just finished doing a military training program in Israel. I was just before I was returning to the workforce properly. And the trip to Sighet for me was the first time that I started to see the world the way my father saw it. Walking around this town that used to have a thriving Jewish population and observing my father responding to Jews who were no longer there. It was almost as though he had a radio that was picking up signals that the rest of us could not pick up, but the signals were there. These people had lived their lives. You could imagine him running around a street corner, picking up the challahs, through the windowsill at his grandmother's as she asks him questions about the weekly Torah portion, racing off to Cheder where he was learning, making sure he got home in time for Shabbat. You could feel the brush of air as that younger man, who was my father, was sort of running past us. It was the first time that I think I saw my father as vulnerable. He was always so strong. And to see him really start to break down in that place had a very powerful effect on me. It really opened up something within me.
Wow. And then from that experience to Auschwitz itself and being with him side by side to sort of experience that, I can't even imagine the power of that moment.
Listen, Auschwitz was terrifying and sober and somber. But if I had to tell you between the two experiences, Sighet was by far the more powerful because Sighet is where the Jews lived. They'd spent a century or more there. They'd taken root. You felt their presence in the spot where you could see the faded place where a mezuzah had been, or the synagogue that had been repurposed or was now full of abandoned scrolls. The Jews went through Auschwitz on their way to their death, but it wasn't a place where they made their mark. Seagate was a place where our people lived, and you felt the immensity of the tragedy in being there.
Yeah, and the loss of that life, the loss of that experience of living, and the vibrancy of that.
They died in Auschwitz, but they lived in Seagate. They lived in all of these towns across Eastern Europe. They put down roots. They bartered with their non-Jewish neighbors. They built shuls. They built schools. Some of them were more secular. Some of them were more observant. They wanted to become doctors. They had this incredible, they had life.
Yeah.
They had what we have. They had life. And to go there and feel its absence was very profound.
I think that's so important. And we talk about that a lot in the work we do here at the center around the need to start with humanizing. In fact, for those, again, who are listening, behind you is the part of our museum that really opens the experience for visitors. And the first thing people see when they come into the museum is life. It was critically important for the folks who designed this space that we start with the humanizing and shrinking the distance between us and them, so that we really can confront the humanity that was lost in this horrific tragedy. Let's talk a little bit about this current moment, and I'll sort of say that generally because there's a lot to unpack. We're sitting sort of broadly in the midst of an era of rising anti-Semitism. And if you zoom out and look at sort of the scope of Jewish history all around the world and for thousands of years, it seems that we're unfortunately in this cycle of, an uptick in anti-Jewish rhetoric and violence against Jewish communities. This past October was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, in Israel specifically. And I think that the Jewish community, it feels to me, and this is interesting, you bring it up in the context of Students Reading Night, is really trying to calibrate. What does this mean today? What is my role today? Where are the red lines? And I'm just, I'm trying to think about the sages who I've known in my life, my grandparents, and what they would say about what's happening right now and how they would help me calibrate. And I'm wondering if in quiet moments, your dad's voice creeps into your head and what does it say about what's happening right now?
I can't say what my father would say.
Yeah.
I don't want to be an AI, natural language processing model trying to do that. I can tell you, as someone who is his son, who was extremely close to him, who has studied him deeply and knew him, I think, on every level it's possible to know him. I can tell you how I feel, and you can choose to accept whether or not that is a reflection of who my father was, and what he would have thought here. This is kind of for all the marbles right now, is the way I see it.
What do you mean by that?
This is the moment where we have to decide how we're going to respond to anti-Semitism. Because Israel's future, I do truly believe, is at stake. Mm-hmm. I don't want to say Israel is so vulnerable that we can just blow on it and it's going to bend over. It's not. But it's hurting. It's hurting very, very badly. And if we are going to have, I think, any self-respect for ourselves as American Jews, we have to stand very, very firmly with Israel. And we have to change our own radar sense of what are we going to tolerate in polite company and what are we not going to tolerate in polite company. I am sure that in the 1930s, in civilized society, you would have people say, the Jews, they're disease-ridden and they steal. And there were some people who'd say, well, that's just them talking, and he doesn't really think that. Mm-hmm. It's just the polite thing to say.
Right.
And I feel that now there are lies being spread about our Jewish brothers and sisters in Israel, that if we don't call them out and oppose them, we are allowing otherwise well-meaning people to be mistaken and rationalize what we saw on October 7th. And there is no rationalizing what we saw on October 7th. What we saw on October 7th was absolute, brutal, gruesome, inhumane barbarism, the worst that is possible for one group of humans to do to another. And in my view, when we hear things like, well, Israel's guilty of apartheid. Whoa, 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 slow down. I think American Jews have an obligation, not an opportunity, but an obligation to double click on that and say, actually, no. There's a pretty complex history here of Israel offering peace on multiple occasions. These are people who have hated us. They elected Hamas into office on the premise that they were more anti-Israel than the PA, not only less corrupt, but explicitly in the charter to destroy Israel. And now we're basically saying that we're going to start introducing moral equivalence and say that Israel is guilty because it doesn't let the people who want to destroy them move freely around their land. I hate to be quote unquote political because I know that there are many people who disagree on this issue. But if you want to know about my father, one must know that my father was not only a humanist, not only an activist for the Muslims in Bosnia, where he went to President Clinton at the opening of the Holocaust Museum and said, we must do something about what's going on in that country. My father was not just the gentle teacher and writer and witness. My father was a Zionist. It's become a bad word in certain circles, and that is a very, very sad day for American Jewry. So I think we need to rediscover our backbone and rediscover our history on this issue.
Some powerful words that was recorded a number of months ago. This was, I think, in November, or maybe even late October, several weeks after October 7th. And of course, things have continued, and there's been many developments since then. But really, a very clear clarion call, and just thinking about his perspective, having known his dad as well, and where the red lines are. I thought it was very sobering to hear him speak about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think he was very wise to kind of take the approach to not try to speak for his father, but as someone who knew him intimately, and we are all, as someone who was close to his father, we're all reflections. All sons are sort of a reflection of their dads, if we're lucky enough to have that type of relationship with them. And so, while we can never say fully, because we can never be in someone else's mind to say what they would have said, I think what they instill in us, the values, the thought processes, the morals that you can speak with a fair degree of certainty, where you think they would have come down. And I think, hearing from Elisha, just the sense of urgency of the moment and the need to really just kind of stand on truth and stand on history and stand on, the right to self-determination for Jews in Israel and here in America, I think, sent a very clear message, at least to me, of the critically important time that we're in right now, the delicate time that we're in right now, and it just seems like we're in a moment of an inflection point in American history and world history and the history of Israel, where the stakes just seem so incredibly high right now. And where we're living in times where we all have to be as thoughtful as we can be, as well-read and knowledgeable as we can be. The most dangerous thing that we can be right now is uninformed and knee-jerk. And I think, the part that scares me the most right now is that far too many of us live in that space where we respond sort of gutturally to things that are going on, instead of really trying to inform and learn and listen. That we're more reactive than responsive, and I think that's dangerous in moments like these. And that's the part that gives me the most concern about where we are, and hearing the gravity of Elisha's words there.
I think also, what happens when we're uninformed, what happens when we jump to react. We were talking about earlier, language in this conversation around Israel, Palestine, and advocacy, why it's so important. If we're not aware and we're not informed, then we actually might be trafficking.
Sure, absolutely.
Without realizing it in language and rhetoric and ideology that we wouldn't otherwise want to traffic in, right? And so to your point, and I think you shared this about, just creating space to absorb other people's concerns and reality and lived experience and history, which is hard because we're all just trying to live our lives and get through the day and like, what time is bedtime for my kids and how do I get there fastest and all that. But, the space like this for conversation to be able to say, wait a minute. I hear that you have some concerns about what's happening in Gaza but when you use this language, when you use language like apartheid, like genocide, first of all, those things have actual definitions. And second of all, they can be used as dog whistles for the Jewish entity in our time is uniquely evil, is the worst thing you can think of. It's not to say that there aren't issues or concerns or challenges or human rights, problems. But it is to say that when we jump right away to these terms, these dog whistles, we got to be aware that anti-Semitism, this is how it shows up. It shows up as projecting the worst of humanity on this group of people called the Jews throughout history. And that's looked different in every chapter. But whatever society finds most abhorrent, that's the default, right?
Right.
It's relatively easy to scapegoat because the Jewish community is, relatively speaking, such a small community. So, many people don't even know someone who's Jewish. Many of the people in this conversation have never stepped foot. They have never even been to the piece of land that they're talking about, that they're so sure they know how to fix, right?
Yeah.
So I just think being aware of where our knowledge begins and ends on things,
Absolutely.
Living in the spirit of Sister Nancy and that student in a space of curiosity and not jumping to a place of, I need to have an opinion on this.
Yes.
Like, can I just be curious enough to learn more is so important.
Absolutely. And we currently don't live in times where that is valued as, where that's valued. We live in
it's not incentivized.
We live in a
It's not incentivized.
clickbaity, we live in a, instant comment society that doesn't even allow. I think I've shared this many times. Like, there'll be times at the Inquirer where I will post an article online and within 30 seconds,
Everybody
of
has
me
something to say
posting,
about it.
somebody has commented, and
Yeah.
I'm saying to myself, like, there's literally no way that you did anything beyond reading the headline. And
you didn't
how
even
can,
read the piece.
Yeah, and how can you possibly venture an opinion? I've been very careful, in since October 7th in terms of, kind of my commentary or, sort of how I've approached discussion on this, mainly because, I have the humility to understand that, I am not learned enough on the subject matter to be able to say anything with any sense of definition other than the deaths are horrible.
That's right.
The attacks are horrible. And holding hostages is horrible. And I really wish we could find some type of resolution to where people didn't have to die. And I feel like for me, like that's as far as I'm comfortable in going and saying things right now in terms of making a determination, because we're talking about, history that's hundreds of years old and conflicts that go, way back and as you said, there was some celebrity that I heard that, wanted to go to the Middle East because they wanted to see for themselves, as if even taking a trip there was somehow or another going to inform them in such a way where they would be able to make
All of a sudden they'd have an
where
epiphany
there
or an
would just
opinion
be
about-
like this
yeah,
light
yeah.
that now I get it. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's that kind of arrogance and hubris that we have that allows us to have the audacity to think that we can have an absolute 100% I'm right, you're wrong opinion on something like this. And I think that, we could all just use a little bit more of a dose of humility. It's okay to feel bad about the death on both sides,
Yeah,
whether that's
right.
Palestinian or whether that's Israelis who are losing their lives. We should all be hurt. We should all be moved by that, and we should all want it to stop as soon as possible. There's nothing wrong in advocating for that and saying that, because I believe that's true.
Yeah.
For the vast majority of people who have concerns about this. But
Yeah.
I think we also just have to be just very careful about how we talk about it.
Yeah, I think, I think that maybe a challenge could be when you feel like you have an opinion, instead have a question.
Exactly.
Instead have a
that's great.
question. Instead of you feel that urge to just express how you think or feel, maybe instead just say, you know what, I'm going to ask. I have a question I'd like to ask
Yeah.
instead. Because you can always have an opinion down the road. You can always, it's not going anywhere, guarantee
Yeah.
it. But I think we need more questions in our world. And Elisha said that in the interview, which we have more of on our YouTube channel. I wish people were more curious.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, because I pastor as well, I always tend to fall back to the Bible, and I'm reminded of the conversation that Job had with God, and God's kind of putting him in his place by kind of letting him know what he doesn't know. Right.
Right. That's
can
right.
Can you tell me how this happened, how this got made, how this was created? And you sort of realize that, even in your own situation, as you're looking at things and trying to figure it out, that what you know is vastly outstripped by what you don't know. And how can you have the audacity to make declarative statements when you know so very little?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so that gets to your point of, curiosity, asking questions, learning, listening. Like that's the big part,
And if people only realize, I feel like if these folks in these protests only realize that they might be advancing closer and faster towards the kind of resolution we all want to see.
Right.
If they asked more questions instead of stating more opinions.
Yes.
It's like if they only realized that, then but I think that is the challenge is dealing with our own how that feels for ourselves to feel like this, because I have no doubt that folks who are protesting, that this comes from a place of like deep concern for humanity.
Absolutely.
Like in most
For sure.
cases, with some exceptions, but in most cases.
Right.
And I think that like if people could just be convinced that like if you care about humanity, if you are concerned about wanting to reach an end to this that does not result in any more innocent life lost, then when you think to speak, instead ask. Instead ask. Lean in and learn. That's got to be the first step.
Absolutely. And when you hear things that people say that might set off a red flag for you, instead of immediately responding to that, ask another question.
That's
What
right.
What did you mean?
Yeah,
by
you can
that?
ask. You can
Yeah.
start with one, but you can ask more than one.
Absolutely. Hey,
Please ask many questions.
I heard you say this. I heard you say this about Israel. What exactly did you mean by that?
Right.
When you say that,
Right.
help me understand what you meant by that. Like just techniques like that. But the challenge with that, Jackie, is that takes time. And that is what we're always up against, isn't it? It's this sense of urgency that we have, that we just don't have time for that. But we don't have time to not make time.
That's right.
For that.
Well, and that's what we've done for more than we've taken more than our fair share of time today. But it's been great. It's been great having this first journey of our first episode, and we're going to be back for more.
Absolutely. And we're so grateful to all of you who've joined us today. We'd love to hear from you about how the ripple effect has played out in your life, or how you might have been inspired today to start your own ripple effect.
Yeah, so we want to know, what did you learn? And maybe more than what you learned and what you're thinking, what are your questions that you have for us? What would you like to hear us talk about? What do you want answers to? Remember that what you do right now when you take off your headphones, what you do today, how you treat people in this moment, it matters. The power to start a ripple of change lies in you. Thanks for joining us. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or visit holocaustandhumanity.org/podcast. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. The Upstander Ripple Effect is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org. Executive producers are David Wise and Jackie Congedo. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills, and technical director is Josh Emerson. The opening sequence is by Ken Furman. Select music is by Kik Lee. Videography and editing are by Michael Holder. This is recorded at Technical Consulting Partners Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.